Hi and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. It's a strange thing, the architecture of memory, how it constructs a home for a person in your mind, a place where they live, breathe, and exist in a form you've meticulously crafted from shared laughter, whispered secrets, and the comfortable silence of a Tuesday night. You build this sanctuary brick by brick, each one a moment, a touch, a promise, until the structure feels as solid and real as the ground beneath your feet. You decorate its rooms with inside jokes and future plans. You trust its foundations. You believe with every fiber of your being that it is a safe place. My sanctuary, the one I built for us, was a beautiful, sprawling thing, filled with the light of a tropical sun and the scent of salt and sea, the very essence of my life here in the Philippines. It was my first real attempt at emotional architecture, my very first relationship, and I thought I was building a cathedral. I had no idea I was building it on a sinkhole, over a chasm of secrets so dark and deep that when the floor finally gave way, it wouldn't just be the structure that fell, but the architect himself, tumbling into an abyss of confusion and betrayal that I'm still, even now, trying to claw my way out of. It has been 2 months. 2 months since the first tremor, the first crack in the foundation that I so desperately tried to ignore. 60 days, 1,440 hours. Each one a tiny, sharp-edged stone in the pit of my stomach. It started, as these things often do, with a mundane moment, a sliver of time so ordinary it's almost offensive in its simplicity. She had left her phone on the charger by the bed, a common enough occurrence. We were supposed to be getting ready to go out, meet some friends for dinner. I remember the sound of the shower running, the steam fogging the mirror, the scent of her shampoo hanging in the air. It was a scene of domestic tranquility, a snapshot from the life I believed we were building together. And then her phone lit up. A notification. I glanced over, not out of suspicion, not then, but out of idle curiosity. The name on the screen was her cousin's. I knew him, had met him a few times at family gatherings. He was always quiet, a little reserved, but seemed pleasant enough. I thought nothing of it. But then another message came through, and another, in quick succession. The screen stayed lit, and my eyes, against my better judgment, were drawn to the string of text. It was in her mother tongue, one of the many dialects that crisscross this archipelago, a language that for 2 years had been the background music of my life but whose lyrics I'd only ever grasped in fragments. It was a wall of unfamiliar words, a script I couldn't decipher. But language, I've learned, is more than just words. It's in the rhythm, the cadence, the context. And even without comprehension, I felt a sudden, sharp pang of unease. There was a flirtatious energy to the messages that even I, a linguistic outsider, could sense. The rapid-fire exchange, the use of certain emojis I recognized, it felt off. And then I saw them. 2 words standing out like jagged rocks in a calm sea, 2 words from my own language, English, embedded in the foreign text. Motel. Check-in. The water from the shower was still running, a steady, soothing sound that suddenly felt mocking, a soundtrack to the complete and utter demolition of my peace. Motel, check in. The words echoed in the silent spaces of my mind, ricocheting off the walls of my carefully constructed sanctuary. They were clinical, transactional, and utterly devoid of the warmth and love I associated with her. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. My breath hitched. The air in the room, once warm and humid, felt thin and cold. I picked up the phone. My hand was trembling, the smooth, cool glass of the screen feeling alien and dangerous. I scrolled up, my eyes scanning the text, desperately searching for context, for some innocent explanation that would make the dread coiling in my gut recede. But there was none to be found. Just more of the same unintelligible script, punctuated by those 2 stark, damning English words. It was a conversation happening in a secret world, a world I was not privy to, and the only 2 words I was allowed to understand were a confirmation of my deepest, most unspoken fears. I felt a surge of nausea, a physical revulsion. I placed the phone back on the charger, my movements stiff and robotic. The shower turned off. The bathroom door opened and she emerged, wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping, a smile on her face. And in that moment, seeing the person I loved, the person I had built my life around, I felt a chasm open between us. She was a stranger. This smiling, beautiful woman was a complete and utter stranger, and I was trapped in a room with her, my mind screaming while my mouth remained shut. I couldn't confront her. Not then. What would I say? I saw a word. I had no proof, only a gut feeling that was so powerful it was making me physically ill. I needed a translator. I needed certainty. I bolted. I mumbled something about forgetting my wallet at a friend's place, an excuse so flimsy it should have shattered on delivery, but she just nodded, still smiling, and told me to hurry back. The drive to our mutual friend's house was a blur. The vibrant, chaotic streets of Manila, usually a source of fascination for me, were nothing but a smear of color and noise. My mind was a vortex, sucking in every possibility, every potential explanation, and spitting them out as grotesque caricatures of the truth. Was it a joke? A misunderstanding? A code for something else? But what else could motel and check-in possibly mean in a conversation that felt so charged, so lascivious? Our mutual friend Anna was the one who had introduced us. She was fluent in both English and the dialect my girlfriend spoke. She was my only hope. I arrived at her apartment unannounced, a wild, desperate look in my eyes that must have terrified her. I shoved the phone into her hands, my own unable to hold it steady any longer, and stammered out a request, a plea. "Translate this, please. I need to know what it says." I watched her face as she read. I watched the initial confusion morph into a frown, then a look of pity, and finally of disgust. She looked up at me, her eyes full of a sorrow that confirmed everything. The words, when they came, were quiet, hesitant, as if she were afraid they would physically wound me. And they did. According to her translation, the conversation was not just flirtatious, it was a negotiation, a cold, hard transaction. She was offering her body, her time, her intimacy for a price. And the price, Anna told me, her voice barely a whisper, was 700 Philippine pesos. 700 pesos. I did the math in my head, a numb, pointless calculation. $14. 14 US dollars. The number was so small, so insignificant, it was insulting. It felt like a punchline to a cruel joke I didn't understand. $14. My world, my love, my future, all reduced to the value of a cheap meal. I stood there in Anna's living room, the phone now feeling impossibly heavy in my hand, the translated words hanging in the air like poison. I was baffled, not just by the betrayal, but by the sheer smallness of it all. It didn't make sense. Nothing made sense. The woman I loved, the woman who claimed to love me, was selling herself for less than the cost of a movie ticket. And the man she was selling herself to, the man she was arranging to meet at a motel, was her own cousin. The world tilted on its axis, and I felt myself falling, tumbling into the darkness with the words motel, check-in, and $14 chanting a demonic lullaby all the way down. That was the beginning of the end, the moment the sinkhole opened up. But I didn't fall all at once. For 2 long, agonizing months, I clung to the crumbling edges, desperately trying to convince myself that the ground beneath me was still solid. The confrontation that night was a masterclass in deflection and emotional manipulation, and I, a novice in the brutal art of romantic warfare, was utterly outmatched. I returned home, the translated words seared into my brain, a toxic litany of betrayal. I felt a cold, hard knot of certainty in my stomach, a certainty that demanded a reckoning. But the moment I saw her, dressed and ready for our dinner, her face a mask of innocent concern, that certainty began to waver. "You were gone so long," she said, her voice laced with a gentle accusation. "Is everything okay?" I held up the phone, my hand shaking again, and the battle began. But it wasn't the explosive, screaming match I had anticipated. It was something far more insidious. She didn't deny it, not outright. Instead, she wove a story, a tapestry of half-truths, cultural misunderstandings, and linguistic nuances designed to make me feel like the villain, the ignorant foreigner who was misinterpreting her world. The dialect, she explained, her eyes filling with tears, was complex. Words had double meanings, hidden contexts that an outsider like me could never hope to understand. Her cousin was going through a difficult time, she claimed, and he needed to borrow money. The 700 pesos, the $14 that had been echoing in my head like a death knell, was a loan, a simple familial loan. But what about motel? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. What about check-in? Her face crumpled in on itself, a performance of exquisite pain. It was a joke, she sobbed, a private, silly joke between them. A way of talking about a secret meeting place to exchange the money, away from the prying eyes of other relatives. It sounded insane. It sounded like the most convoluted, nonsensical explanation I had ever heard. But I wanted to believe it. Oh God, how I wanted to believe it. Because the alternative was that my entire relationship was a lie, that the woman I loved was capable of a betrayal so profound it would shatter me. And so, I chose to believe. I chose to accept the bizarre, the improbable, the patently absurd because it was less painful than the truth. That decision marked the beginning of my 2-month descent into a self-imposed purgatory. I became a willing prisoner in a jail of my own making, the bars forged from her lies and my desperate need for them to be true. Life continued, but it was a hollowed-out version of what it once was. We still went out to dinner, still held hands, still slept in the same bed. But a shadow had fallen over everything. It was in the silences between us, silences that were once comfortable but were now pregnant with unspoken questions. It was in her touch, which I now found myself flinching from, my mind replaying the translated messages, imagining those same hands typing those words. I became an obsessive detective in my own home, a paranoid spy in my own relationship. I would watch her when she was on her phone, trying to read her expression, to decipher the intent behind her smile or her frown. I'd listen intently when she spoke to her family on the phone, trying to pick out words, to find a clue that would either confirm my fears or, preferably, obliterate them forever. The language barrier that had once been a charming quirk of our cross-cultural relationship was now a towering wall between us, a fortress behind which she could hide her secrets. And she used it masterfully. Whenever I would question something, whenever a sliver of doubt would pierce my carefully constructed denial, she would retreat behind the shield of her mother tongue. "You just don't understand," she would say, a frustrated, pitying tone in her voice. "This is how we talk. This is our culture. You're not from here. You can't possibly get it." And I, the outsider, the foreigner, would be forced to retreat, feeling foolish and paranoid. She made me feel like I was the one who was crazy. I started to question my own sanity, my own perception of reality. Was I just an overly jealous boyfriend? Was I projecting my own insecurities onto her? Was I destroying the best thing that had ever happened to me because of a simple misunderstanding? The eyes dragged into weeks, and the weeks into 2 agonizing months. The knot of anxiety in my stomach was a constant companion. I lost weight. I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, her peaceful, sleeping form beside me a source of both comfort and torment. Who was this person? Who was I sharing my life with? Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would slip out of bed, take her phone, and just stare at it. The temptation to go back to Anna to ask for another translation of another conversation, almost overwhelming. But I never did. I was too afraid of what I might find. I was a coward, clinging to a beautiful lie because the ugly truth was too much to bear. Her explanations for things became more and more bizarre, and my acceptance of them became a testament to my desperation. There were late-night phone calls she would take outside, explaining they were family emergencies. There were times she'd come home late, smelling faintly of cheap perfume that wasn't her own, claiming she'd been helping a friend with a crisis. Each time, she would have a story, an elaborate, detailed narrative that was just plausible enough to allow me to suspend my disbelief for one more day. I was living in a state of cognitive dissonance, holding 2 contradictory beliefs in my mind simultaneously. I love and trust this woman, and this woman is lying to me and betraying me. The mental gymnastics required to maintain this delicate balance were exhausting. I felt like I was losing my mind, piece by piece. The vibrant, confident man I was before I met her was disappearing, replaced by a hollow-eyed, anxious ghost. My friends started to notice. They'd ask me what was wrong, why I was so distant, so on edge. But I couldn't tell them. How could I explain that I was willingly participating in a lie that was eating me alive? How could I admit that I was too weak to face the truth? Admitting it to them would mean admitting it to myself, and I wasn't ready for that. So I isolated myself, pushing away the people who cared about me, retreating further into the toxic bubble of my relationship. It was just me and her, and the lies that hung between us, shimmering and beautiful and deadly like a spider's web. I was trapped, and I was beginning to think I would never be free. I was too blind, too in love, and too terrified of being alone. My very first relationship. I had nothing to compare it to, no past experience to guide me. I didn't see it coming because I didn't know what to look for. I didn't see the red flags because I didn't even know what color they were. All I saw was her, the architect of my first cathedral of love, and I kept telling myself that the cracks in the walls were just part of the design. I kept telling myself that the tremor I felt was just the settling of a new foundation, not the precursor to a catastrophic collapse. I was a fool, a willing, hopeful fool, and I was about to pay the price for my blindness. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating click. It was the click of a mouse, the sound of a file opening, the whisper of a voice that was not hers speaking words that were. For 2 months, I had been the sole gatekeeper of my own torment, refusing to seek outside counsel, refusing to admit the depth of my suspicion to anyone else, least of all to Anna, who had already seen the ugly truth and had looked at me with such pity. But the human mind can only endure so much cognitive dissonance before it begins to fracture. The constant anxiety, the sleepless nights, the gnawing uncertainty, it had all taken its toll. I was a shell of my former self, and one morning I woke up and realized I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't live in the gray ambiguity for another day. I needed black or white. I needed the truth, no matter how much it hurt. My cowardice had finally been eclipsed by my desperate need for reality. I couldn't go back to Anna. My shame was too great. So I did something I should have done weeks earlier. I took a few screenshots of the original conversation, the one that had started it all, and a few more recent ones that I found suspicious. I sent them to an online translation service, a faceless, anonymous entity that would pass no judgment, offer no pity. It would just give me the facts. I paid the small fee and uploaded the files. And then I waited. The wait was excruciating. Every email notification made my heart leap into my throat. I tried to work to distract myself, but my mind was a one-track loop of dread and anticipation. I was standing on the gallows, waiting for the executioner to pull the lever, half of me praying for a last-minute pardon, the other half just wanting the fall to be over. The email arrived late that afternoon. The subject line was clinical. "Your translation order is complete." I stared at it for a long time, my finger hovering over the mouse. This was it, the point of no return. Once I opened this email, my life, the one I had so carefully constructed around a fragile lie, would be over. I clicked. The document was a simple PDF file, the original text on one side, the English translation on the other. I started to read, and with each word, another brick from my cathedral of love crumbled into dust. The translation was not just similar to what Anna had told me. It was worse. It was more explicit, more detailed, more sordid. The bizarre explanations she had fed me were exposed for what they were: pathetic, desperate lies. The conversation wasn't just a negotiation, it was a confirmation of a previous arrangement. The joke about the motel was no joke, it was a plan. The messages detailed times, preferences, a chillingly casual discussion of the act itself. And the money, the 700 pesos, wasn't a loan, it was payment. Payment for services rendered. The document laid it all bare, stripping away the poetry and romance of my first love and leaving only the cold, stark prose of a transaction. And then I saw the name again. Her cousin. The messages were filled with terms of endearment, twisted and perverse in this new context. They were not just business partners. There was a familiarity, an intimacy that spoke of a long-standing arrangement. The betrayal was deeper, darker, and more incestuous than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. I felt a profound, soul-deep revulsion. I closed the laptop. The room was silent. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the floor. For the first time in 2 months, the frantic noise in my head went quiet. The anxiety, the doubt, the desperate hope, it all vanished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. There was no more uncertainty. There was only the truth in all its ugly, brutal clarity. She came home an hour later, humming a cheerful tune, a bag of groceries in her hand. She smiled at me, that same beautiful smile that had once been the sun in my sky, and asked what I wanted for dinner. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't throw things. The rage I expected to feel wasn't there. All I felt was a vast Arctic emptiness. I turned the laptop around and showed her the screen. I watched her face as she read the translated words, the words she thought I would never understand. I watched the color drain from her cheeks, the cheerful facade crumble, the smile evaporate. Her eyes darted back and forth between the screen and my face, searching for an escape route, another lie, another explanation. But there were none left. Her fortress of linguistic ambiguity had been breached, and she was utterly exposed. For a moment she tried. A few sputtered words in her dialect, the beginning of another story, but I just shook my head, a slow, deliberate movement. "No more," I said, my voice sounding distant, as if it belonged to someone else. "No more lies." And then she broke. The tears came, but they were not the calculated, manipulative tears of our first confrontation. These were the ragged, desperate sobs of someone who had been caught, of someone whose world was collapsing. She didn't try to explain the motel or the money. She knew it was pointless. Instead, she did what I suppose she thought was the only thing left to do. She tried to make it my fault. She talked about the financial pressures from her family, the expectations, the difficulties of her life that I, the privileged foreigner, could never comprehend. She painted herself as a victim, a martyr, forced into this situation by circumstances beyond her control. But I wasn't listening. The words were just noise. My mind was fixated on one detail, the one detail that still baffled me beyond all others. $14, I said, cutting through her litany of excuses. Why? Why so little? The question seemed to surprise her. Her tears stopped for a moment. She looked at me, a genuine confusion in her eyes, as if she didn't understand the question. And in that moment I understood. To her it wasn't a small amount. The value of the act, the value of her body, the value of my trust, it was all relative. And to her it was worth about 700 pesos. That was the most devastating blow of all. It wasn't just that she had betrayed me. It was that she had sold our love, our intimacy, our entire world for pocket change. It meant that what we had, what I thought was a priceless cathedral, was to her worth nothing at all. The blindness was gone. I saw everything with a terrifying clarity. My very first relationship. And what a lesson it had been. I hadn't just seen it coming. I had actively participated in my own deception, a willing accomplice to my own heartbreak. The foundations hadn't just settled. They had been rotten from the very start. And now, all that was left was the rubble. The silence that followed her departure was the loudest thing I had ever heard. It wasn't just the absence of her voice, her laughter, her footsteps on the wooden floor. It was a profound, echoing emptiness, a void where a life used to be. She packed her bags in a flurry of sobs and resentful glares, throwing her clothes into a suitcase with a violence that felt directed at me. I just sat on the couch, numb, watching her erase herself from our shared space. I didn't help, I didn't hinder. I was merely a spectator to the final scene of a tragedy I had co-authored. When the door finally closed behind her, the click of the lock sounded like a final, definitive judgment. And then, the silence. In the immediate aftermath, I moved through the apartment like a ghost. I'd walk into a room and forget why I was there. I'd stand in front of the open refrigerator, staring at its contents without seeing them. Time seemed to warp and stretch, hours feeling like minutes and minutes feeling like eternities. The first task was purging. I started with the bathroom, throwing away her toothbrush, her half-empty bottles of shampoo and conditioner, the things that still held her scent. It was a pathetic, furious ritual. I gathered all her remaining possessions, a book she'd left behind, a stray earring, a scarf, and put them in a box which I then unceremoniously dumped in the trash chute of the apartment building. Then came the digital purge. This was harder. Our lives, like most people's, were meticulously documented online. I untagged myself from every photo, deleted every post that mentioned her. And then I came to my own camera roll. Hundreds, thousands of pictures. Her smiling at a beach in Palawan. Her sleeping on my shoulder on a long bus ride. Her laughing as she tried to cook my favorite dish and burned it. Each photo was a tiny, sharp knife to the heart. For a moment, I considered keeping them, archiving them away as a record of a time that, despite its ending, had contained moments of genuine happiness. But I knew I couldn't. To heal, I needed to amputate. So, with a deep breath and a trembling thumb, I selected all of them and pressed delete. It felt like I was deleting a part of my own history, a part of myself. The anger came later. It arrived in waves, a hot, searing rage that left me breathless. Anger at her for her lies, for her betrayal, for the casual cruelty of it all. Anger at her cousin for his part in this sordid familial corruption. But most of all, there was a deep, corrosive anger at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have been so stupid? The red flags, in retrospect, were not just red. They were giant, waving, crimson banners, and I had marched past them, whistling a happy tune. My naivety felt like a character flaw, a terminal weakness. This was my very first relationship, and I had poured everything I had into it. My trust, my vulnerability, my hopes for the future. I had handed them all over to her, and she had taken them and sold them for $14. The thought was a recurring torment, a mental loop I couldn't escape. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about the valuation. It was the knowledge that I had been so utterly and completely worthless to her. That was the wound that refused to close. I replayed the 2 months of limbo over and over in my mind. Her bizarre explanations, once a source of comfort, now seemed like a form of psychological torture she had inflicted upon me. I saw the condescension in her voice when she'd said, "You just don't understand our culture." She had used my status as a foreigner not just as a shield for her lies, but as a weapon against me, making me feel ignorant and paranoid for questioning her. The isolation I had felt before now intensified. I was adrift in a country that was not my own, my trust in my own judgment completely shattered. If I could be so wrong about her, who could I ever be right about? Every smiling face now seemed like a potential mask, every kind word a potential lie. The experience had planted a seed of cynicism in my heart that I feared would grow and choke out any future possibility of love or trust. The Philippines, a country I had come to love for its warmth and vibrancy, suddenly felt hostile and alien. I started to see potential deception everywhere. I withdrew from friends, ashamed to tell them the full story, ashamed of my own gullibility. I was the foolish foreigner, the classic cautionary tale. I thought about leaving, about packing my bags and going back to a place where the language was my own, where the cultural cues were familiar. But I knew that running away wouldn't solve anything. The ghosts of this relationship would follow me wherever I went. I had to face them here, in the rubble of the life I had built. Slowly, painfully, I began the process of rebuilding. It started with small things, forcing myself to eat a proper meal, going for a long walk without a destination, reaching out to one friend then another and letting them in just a little bit. Telling the story, as humiliating as it was, began to rob it of its power. Saying the words out loud, "She was selling herself to her cousin for $14, made it sound as insane as it was, and less like a personal failure on my part. I am still here. It has been 2 months since the final discovery, 4 months since the first crack appeared in the wall. The cathedral is gone, reduced to a pile of dust and debris. Some days I still find myself sifting through the wreckage, picking up a shard of a memory and feeling the sting of its sharp edge. The healing process is not linear. There are good days, filled with a fragile sense of hope, and there are bad days when the silence in the apartment becomes deafening again. I don't know if I will ever fully trust someone again, or if I will ever be able to enter into a relationship without a part of me holding back, waiting for the inevitable betrayal. The scar from this first attempt at love is deep and jagged, but I am the architect. And though my first creation was a catastrophic failure built on a foundation of lies, I have to believe that I can build again. This time I will be more careful. I will test the ground. I will look for the fault lines. I will build something smaller, perhaps less grand, but something with a foundation of truth, something that can withstand the tremors of this world. It's a long road, and I'm just at the beginning of it. But for the first time in a long time, I am looking forward, not back. Thank you for listening this story. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. Click like and subscribe to the Reddit Whispers for more.